So John Klavitter currently serves as the National Coordinator for Invasive Species, Island Restoration, and the Cooperative Recovery Initiative for the National Wildlife Refuge System within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Headquarters Office in Falls Church, Virginia. He leads teams that provide funding and guidance to refuges to completely eradicate invasive species and recover threatened and endangered species. In his current capacity, he co-led a translocation of endangered Laysan ducks from Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge to Cure Atoll to establish a new population and was part of a U.S. delegation that traveled to China to share information about wetland management. Before his current role at headquarters, Klavitter was stationed at Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge as the refuge biologist and the deputy project leader, where he helped to manage a visitor program, an airfield, and habitat for a host of species including endangered Laysan ducks, short-tailed albatrosses, and 3 million seabirds. He also co-led a team that translocated endangered Laysan ducks from Laysan Island to Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge to reestablish a population that once presumably occurred there. Klavitter received his Bachelor of Science degree from Iowa State University in Animal Ecology and his Master's of Science degree in Wildlife Science from the University of Washington. He conducted his graduate research on the endangered Hawaiian hawk to determine if the population had recovered to the level where downlisting or delisting the species under the Species Act was warranted. That's a lot, John.
Oh, thanks.
That's awesome. And I always ask them for a fun fact. So his fun fact, which is really cool, is he's got to snorkel with President Obama at the Midway National Wildlife Refuge in 2016. So thank you for joining us today. Yeah, you're definitely one of those goal type people up there. So thank you for joining us today. We're really excited. And you can start whenever you want.
Well, thank you for having me. This is really exciting to see everybody, and I know these are challenging times that we're all facing, but hopefully you and your families are safe, happy, and healthy, and we'll get through this together. So again, I'm happy to be here today, and thank you for that nice introduction, Carrie, and I'm happy to share my work with you today, and specifically, I'm going to talk about Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge and some of the work that I was involved in there. I was stationed there for 12 years, and it was awesome. It was phenomenal. So I'll get started. So it's a shame that I can't, I won't be able to see you as I present, but that's okay. All right, so during my presentation, I want to talk about the purpose of the refuge, give you some background on the refuge, talk about its history, all the natural resources out there, some of the key issues that we were dealing with, and discuss our management and programs. And as Carrie mentioned along the way, if you have questions, you can ask away. And again, I can't see you now because I'm on my main screen, but just feel free to interrupt me and ask away. All right, so the purpose of Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge, it was established to preserve the biological diversity that is found in the Pacific Islands. It was also established to protect wildlife and the habitat that they depend on. There's a lot of historical resources that I'll talk about in a moment. So again, it's really important to protect those historical resources. Midway also has a lot of migratory birds, and we can obliged by the International Migratory Bird Treaty and other treaties by protecting those migratory seabirds. Midway is there to conduct scientific research so that we can learn not only about Midway itself, but about the Pacific and the planet, and so that we can monitor the health of the world. It's also there for environmental education and compatible recreation. And another mission I'll talk about is there's an emergency landing strip out there. Every commercial airliner that flies over the Pacific is within so many miles of Midway, and if they have an emergency, they can land there, and we've had a couple over the years. All right, so some background on Midway. The Hawaiian name for Midway is called Pihe Manu, and that translates as the loud sound of birds. And as Carrie mentioned in my introduction, there are 3 million seabirds out there, and it's a wonderful cacophony of of seabird sounds out there, and so that's a very fitting name that the Hawaiians had. In 1988, when the Navy was still out at Midway, and I'll talk about the location in a minute, they recognized how important all the resources were out there, so they invited the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is a federal department, to come out there and establish a refuge when they still had the Navy base. And so that went on for a number of years. And then in 1993, the Navy decided to close the base, and it took 3 years to close things down. And then in 1996, the Navy gave the property to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it became a standalone National Wildlife Refuge. In the year 2000, we also became a national memorial to the Battle of Midway to recognize the importance of the area as a memorial and also to remember the sacrifice that so many Americans made who lost their lives to protect our freedom and our country. And then in 2006, President Bush declared it part of the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument that protected a bigger area, and I'll show a map in a second. And then in the year 2010, it also became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So again, very important. So where is Midway? Well, here's a nice map, and you can see that you're located in the Gulf States over here. I'm over here in Washington, D.C., and here is Midway, so way out in the Pacific. So the reason it's called Midway, it's kind of midway between the United States and Japan. And it's one of the most remote inhabited places on the planet. So it's way out there. And in fact, in order to get there, you need to fly first to Honolulu, Hawaii. And then once you get to Honolulu, Hawaii, then you take a small little jet and travel 1,250 miles to the northwest to reach Midway. So here's another map. Here is Honolulu, Hawaii, right here on the island of Oahu. And again, it's 1,200 miles all the way out to Midway. So these are the Hawaiian Islands, or they call it the Hawaiian Archipelago. And these are the islands where people live on for the most part. And then all these little islands here are uninhabited islands. They call them the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And they all make up this protected area called the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. And within that protected area, there are 2 national wildlife refuges. Number 1 is the Hawaiian Islands National Wildlife Refuge, and then here it is, Midway Atoll National Wildlife right here. And the age of the island's about 30 million years old. So 30 million years ago, this island was actually located in the same spot as this island here is. And this Midway was formed by lava. And as the plates of the earth moved, Midway moved off the lava hotspot, and then it began to drift slowly to the northwest, and here it is again today. And there's one more atoll that's further to the north. It's called Kiri Atoll, and that's where we moved some endangered ducks from Midway to Kiri, and that's another 5 million years older than Midway, so that's like 35 million years old. All right, so here's a view from space, and so what you have is a fringing reef that goes all the way around Midway. So this is live coral. If you took a boat across here, it's about 5 miles across it. It's about 22 miles to go around. It has 3 islands. This is called Sand Island. This is the main island where we have some leftover buildings from the military, and this is where Fish and Wildlife Service houses their staff and contractors and volunteers. This island's about 1,200 acres. We have another little island here, 14 acres, called Spit Island, and another island here called Eastern Island, and it's about 350 acres. You can see an old landing strip there, and here is a landing strip that's currently used for fish and wildlife activities, and again, as an emergency airstrip as well. One of the common features of an atoll is that it has a deep spot in the center. And so the military recognized the importance, and they did some additional dredging to make a channel that went through the reef here. They could turn around ships in here, and they built a harbor, and they could land planes in here as well. The refuge total acreage is about 580,000 acres, and it goes out 12 miles beyond the reef. So that's Midway. So some more history. The Hawaiians were the first ones to find Midway. They sailed there in these double-hulled canoes about 500 AD, and they found Midway. And they talk about Midway in their chants, and they didn't set up a permanent, residence there, but they would travel there occasionally. And again, they talk about Midway in their chants. The first Westerners to arrive to Midway were in 1859, and it was a person, his name was Captain Brooks, and he was interested in finding Midway because all these millions of seabirds, as they defecate on the ground, the defecation builds up and it creates fertilizer. They call it guano. And back in the day, it was worth a lot of money. And so back in 1859, Captain Brooks found it for the United States under the Guano Mining Act of 1856. And he named Midway the Middle Brooks Island, and later it was just changed to Midway Atoll or Midway Island. Unfortunately, there was a lot of impact to the wildlife for many, many years. People were interested in harvesting seabirds for their feathers. So this is an albatross, a Laysan albatross. So they would harvest them for their feathers. They would harvest their eggs. These are all seabird eggs from albatrosses. They're about the size of your fist. They're about 5 chicken eggs. And they would send these back as a delicacy in Asia, or they would use the white part of the egg, albumin, to process photographs. They would also harvest Hawaiian monk seals and turtles. So lots of impact during that time period. Teddy Roosevelt was the president in 1903, and he found out about Midway and how unique it was, and so he decided to send Marines out there to protect the wildlife, to evict the poachers that were out there, and that was really the first step for conservation of Midway and even in our country in 1903. And then at the same time, there was a group that was interested in setting up a cable company at Midway so they could have a telegraph cable that would cross the Pacific, so they could have communication across the Pacific. So they built 4 of these buildings that still stand today, or one of them still stands today, and that cable was very important for many, many years, including during the Battle of Midway during World War II, 1942. Also in the 1940s, Pan American Airlines flew float planes out to Midway. It was one of the stops where people would fly from San Francisco to Hong Kong. And so they would stay at Midway for a week at a time, and they had a small little hotel on the island, and they would stay and they would continue on their way. And that venture worked pretty well until World War II broke out, and then it was no longer safe to fly across the Pacific, and the military took possession of the hotel out there and even used their planes to fly supplies out to Midway. Midway might be best known for the Battle of Midway that happened in June 1942. And before this battle, the Japanese were going across the Pacific, and they were conquering different islands, and their plan was to take Midway, lure the American fleet out there, destroy it, then take the Hawaiian Islands, and then move on to the west coast of the United States. Fortunately, the military cracked the secret Japanese code before that happened. They were able to intercept the Japanese fleet out at Midway and destroy them, and that was the turning point in the war in the Pacific and even in World War II. So that's a very historic battle, and there's still some remnants of there's some sunken planes out there and some bombs that you can snorkel over in the lagoon. So again, that's why it's a memorial to the Battle of Midway that happened in June of 1942. In the 1950s, there was a new threat to our country. It was a threat of nuclear war. And Midway again came to the forefront to defend our country. And so they set up a series of antennas out on Midway called the DEW line antenna system. This stood for Distant Early Warning Line Antenna Field. And these antennas acted as radar. So if the Russians were headed to the west coast of the United States, we would hopefully intercept them here with our antennas and warn the rest of the country that the Russians were on their way to bomb our country. So this lasted for about 10 years or so, from the 1950s to the 1960s, and then satellites came into play, and this antenna field was no longer needed. I will say that during World War II, there were as many as 5,000 people on the island. During the 1950s, there were 5,000 people, and after that, they dropped the population down to just about 200 to kind of do minimum maintenance out there. And then, as I mentioned before, in the 1980s, the Navy decided to protect the resources, and they invited the Fish and Wildlife Service to establish a refuge while the Navy was still there. 1996, the Navy left the property to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and again, we managed it as a standalone National Wildlife Refuge, and our mission is pretty simple: wildlife first, and we're here to protect all the unique biological resources out there. I'm going to talk about the wildlife now and the history, but I'll pause there just for a second just to see if anyone has any questions so far.
Cody, do you want to ask yours since it's, is your audio working or do I need to read it?
It's
Just
working.
since it's related. Okay, you can go ahead since it's related to the history.
Did any of the Battle of Midway remnants have to be removed in order to make the refuge suitable for migratory birds?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, it's definitely a balance between preserving the historical features of, you know, the past, and then also making sure you have safe areas for the wildlife. And so all the dew line antennas that were there had to be removed because every day there would be tens or hundreds of albatross that would crash into the antennas and lay dead below. So those were all removed for the safety of the wildlife. When the military was there, there were about 300 buildings there, and they removed about 200 of them before Fish and Wildlife arrived because, again, they were taking up physical space. The albatross need space to nest in, so they removed about 200 buildings and left 100 in place. One of the big issues that we found out later, once the military left, we found out that all the buildings that were remaining had lead paint on them, and as the paint chipped off, the albatross chicks would eat the paint and basically get lead poisoning and die. And so we were losing 10,000 chicks from lead poisoning. So we removed all the lead-based paint from the buildings and from the sand. So those are some of the things that we did remove. So
that's quite a job. That's amazing.
Yeah. Good question. I love the cat ears. I think that's great. It's got the cat ears on. Nice. All right. Excellent. I'll jump back into it. So here we have, again, 3 million seabirds out at Midway, and 1.5 million of them are these birds out here. These are called Laysan albatross, and they are amazing, magnificent seabirds. They have a wingspan that is about 6 to 7 feet across. They can fly about 500 miles in a day. They fly right next to the surface of the ocean. For 3 months of the year, they're out at the ocean. They drink salt water and they forage mainly on squid. And then so for 3 months of the year, you don't see any albatrosses at Midway. And then late in September, early October, the first one shows up. And then a day later, 10 show up. 2 days later, 100. 3 days later, 1,000, then 10,000. And then within about 3 weeks, all 1.5 million are back. It's like a snowstorm. And they mate for life. They're long-lived. The oldest one is 69 years old. Her name is Wisdom, and she's still having babies. And they nest in the same exact spot. They keep their mates for life. They come back. They do this neat courtship dance, and then they lay an egg. That's, again, about the size of your fist, or about 5 chicken eggs. It takes 65 days for the egg to hatch, and out pops this little chick. And then it takes about 5.5 months for the chick to grow into a bird that can fly away from Midway. They spend the first 3 to 7 years of their life out at sea, and then they come back to Midway and they start to dance and find their own mate. So that's kind of their life history for the Laysan albatross. These are black-footed albatross. There's about 60,000 black-footed albatross, and Midway is home to the largest albatross colonies in the world, and we have more Laysan albatross and black-footed albatross than any other place on the planet. There's a third species of albatross out there called the short-tailed albatrosses. Their wingspan is even bigger. It's about 9 feet across, and they have golden neck and head and a pink bill. And at one point, they were the most numerous seabird in the Pacific. There were 5 million of them, and by 1950, they were hunted to near extinction. In fact, they thought they were extinct in 1950, and then there was a small population found on an island in Japan called Torishima Island, and there was just less than 50 birds left, and there was a small fishing village there, and fortunately for the albatross, unfortunately for the people, the volcano that the island had on the island erupted and covered over the fishing village. The people were taken out, but that basically saved the albatross from extinction. So now there's about 3,000 in the world, and we have a small population at Midway that we've been able to bring back using decoys, and I'll talk about them in a minute. These are the endangered Laysan ducks. They're one of the most endangered ducks in the world, and they were found in all the Hawaiian Islands. And because of people and predators, they were reduced to 2 breeding females by 1911. And from that small population that came back, there were about 600 on Laysan Island. We moved some to Midway and then to Curie to continue that population. We have white terns or fairy terns. They're really magical. If you have really good karma, they can land right on your hand. We have great frigate birds out there. These are the males. They puff out their gular pouch, and that's how they attract the female. And one of the things that they do is they chase other birds around. They make them vomit their fish, and then they steal their fish, and that's how they make a living. And their wingspan is about 8 feet across. There are red-tailed tropic birds, so they have a beautiful red bill and long red tail feathers. And they're divers. They plunge and they dive for squid and fish in the ocean. We have sooty terns. If you ever have seen the movie by Alfred Hitchcock, The Birds, they recorded the sound that the sooty terns make and used it in the movie. But to see like 100,000 sooty terns flying over your head is pretty amazing to be within that colony. We also have shorebirds that spend part of the year there, and they nest up in Alaska, but on their way they stop at Midway. This is called the bristle-thighed curlew. Uses this long bill to probe in the sand and pick up crabs. We have about 24 different species of native plants out there, and this is the most numerous native plant. It's called bunchgrass, and all the seabirds use it. The albatross use it for shade. There's ground nesting birds that will burrow underneath it and make a little burrow, and that's where they lay their egg and have their chicks. And this is one of the main plants that we've been planting to restore habitat out there. We have about 200 non-native plants or invasive plants that we've been removing, and I'll talk about some in a minute. There's also a school of about 200 spinner dolphins in the atoll. There are manta rays out there. There's about 250 species of reef fish. These are goatfish. There's about 12 species of shark. These are Galapagos sharks. There's all sorts of resources on the reef. These are pencil urchins. There's amazing species of corals out there, nudibranchs. We have endangered Hawaiian monk seals out there. So these seals are found only in the Pacific. And again, they were found on all the Hawaiian Islands, but because of people, they were hunted to near extinction. So they are endangered under the Endangered Species Act. There's about 50 at Midway. And I think I'm kind of biased, but they're one of the most charismatic and cutest seals in the world, I think, with their little brown eyes. There's also a population of green sea turtles out there, and they are nesting at Midway now. And so those are some of the resources. Next, I'll talk a little bit about some of the programs out there and touch on climate change, storms, and tsunamis. I'll talk about impacts of fisheries. I mentioned this before about the lead-based paint. I'll talk about that for a minute. I'll talk about marine debris and invasive species. And again, I'll pause there for a second and see if there's any questions.
Oh, can we just ask? Okay.
Sure.
One of the questions I had was when it comes down to any of these organisms that you've listed so far, can you just sell me any of their key benefits and functions that they actually have on the environment and ecosystem around them? Like for example, the albatross.
I missed the first part of the question. So the albatross, you mentioned what function do they have on the ecosystem? Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Oh yeah, the albatross, they play a really important role in the ecosystem out there. So the island itself is made out of coral sand, and so it doesn't have a lot of nutrients for the native plants to grow. And so one of the important functions the albatross play is that as they eat squid and fish in the ocean, they come back to the island and they defecate on the island. And so that guano I mentioned before, that's a rich source of fertilizer for the native plants that depend on the island. And then as it rains, the guano also filters through the sand and then out to the corals. And that also provides nitrogen for the corals as well. And so if you remove albatross from the ecosystem, all of a sudden your native plants stop thriving and your native corals stop thriving. So Midway are definitely a key component of that ecosystem. Good question.
Amber, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I was asking if there's been any major disadvantages to the genetic bottleneck to the lace sand ducks.
Oh, another excellent question. You know, typically when you reduce a population to such low levels, you definitely have genetic issues. You lose genetic variability, and so if a disease comes through, they're less able to adapt to the disease. Fortunately, with birds, they tend not to be as affected by genetic bottlenecks compared to mammals. Like the Florida panther, for example, they've been so inbred that they have difficulty with their offspring surviving. I think the males only have one testicle now. But for birds and even the lace-hand ducks, we don't see as many issues with them. But we've measured the genetic variability with lace-hand ducks, and the variability is a lot lower compared to their closest relative, which is the mallard on the mainland. And one of the issues right now we're having is that they're really highly susceptible to botulism. So that might be one of the consequences to that genetic bottleneck.
And Austin, I think you had a question.
I didn't know if you were about to go over this next anyway, as far as invasive species, but I know as far as like Easter Island and New Zealand, rats are a huge problem out there. Have you had issues with that already, or have they since been removed?
Oh, another great question. I'm going to go over that in a second, but rats were found at Midway from the 1940s until 1997, and they were stowaways aboard the military equipment that went out to Midway, and they wreaked havoc on all the seabirds out there. And so that was one of the things that the Navy funded just before they left. So in 1993, they funded a 4-year program to eradicate the rats. It took $1 million in 4 years, but it was successful. Now the rats are gone, and all the seabirds are thriving because of that rat eradication. We do have mice still on the atoll, and for many, many years the mice didn't pose a problem. But 4 years ago, we noticed that the mice were starting to eat albatross alive as they were nesting. And part of that change was that we removed an invasive plant out there that served as a seed source for the mice. And once we took away that seed source, then they turned to eating albatross alive. And so we received funding, and we're going to eradicate the mice out there. We were scheduled to do it this summer, but now with the current pandemic affecting the planet, we had to delay plans to eradicate the mice until next summer. So good question. Awesome, great. Well, I'll jump back into the presentation, but really good questions, and feel free to interrupt as I go. Fishing is a big issue. So this is a fishing hook in the neck of a black-footed albatross. So fortunately, we were able to catch the bird and cut the hook off here and pull it out. And the albatross was saved. But the albatross follow fishing boats around the Pacific, and they go after the baited hooks, and they get hooked and die. And so this is one of the most significant sources of mortality for adult albatrosses. Fortunately, biologists have worked with the fishermen over the years, and they figured out ways to prevent the albatross from getting at the hooks. And so they've done two things. One is that they put streamers on their lines to scare the albatross away from the baited fishing hooks, and so there's less albatross that get hooked. And instead of releasing the baited hooks close to the surface, they have a way to release them about 10 to 20 feet underneath the surface of the water, and so the albatross physically can't get at the hooks. And so that's been a tremendous impact that's been reduced. So that's pretty positive. We do demographic monitoring of albatrosses out there to understand how long they live, how many chicks they have, and we do this for a couple reasons. One is that we can monitor the health of the albatrosses themselves to see how they're doing, because Fish and Wildlife is responsible to making sure that albatrosses and the other seabirds are doing well. But then also, because they travel so far around the Pacific, they fly up to Alaska to forage to feed their chicks, and they do this weekly. They're basically a barometer for the health of the Pacific and even the health of the planet. So by monitoring albatross, we're really monitoring the health of the planet. So when we see declines in albatrosses, we know that something is going awry with climate change, and that's a warning signal that we can use to let the scientific community and even our political leaders know that we need to make changes in order to protect the planet for people, ultimately. Marine debris is a huge issue. All across the planet, especially in Asia, people are throwing plastic into the street. It goes into a storm drain, into a river, and then ultimately ends up into the ocean. And so every year we have about 20 tons of plastic that washes up to the reef, the shoreline, or is eaten by an albatross and fed to chicks. And so 20 tons a year. So this is some of the material that we pick up. So we have volunteers and staff that go out to the reefs and remove the discarded fishing nets and things that can entangle monk seals and turtles and bring them back to the main island at Midway. And then a couple times a year, we take a ship and ship it back to Honolulu. And this is either recycled or burned in the power plant on Oahu or Honolulu for power. So that's a big issue that we're trying to deal with. Here's an example of these Hawaiian monk seals getting trapped by fishing nets. And fortunately, we found these animals in time, and we were able to disentangle the monk seals before they drowned. And this is some of the staff and volunteers removing those nets and ropes off the beaches and off the coral reef itself. And I mentioned the albatross. The albatross confuse plastic for squid, and so they'll pick up the plastic on the ocean. They'll come back and feed it to their chicks on Midway. We have about 400,000 chicks hatched each year on Midway. 90% or 99% of them have plastic in their stomach. So the healthy ones have about a ½ ounce. The ones that don't make it have more than an ounce in them. So this is inside every albatross chick at Midway. The healthy ones, if they don't have too much, they're able to cough up a pellet called a bolus. That's what this is right here. It looks like an owl pellet. And so the healthy ones can get rid of most of the plastic, but the ones that have too much in, they basically can't get rid of it, and they do die from that. So it's really, it is really sad. So about 5 tons of plastic are brought in by the adult albatross and fed to their chicks each year. So 5 tons, that's amazing. Invasive plants are another big issue. This plant here is called Verbicina insuloides, or golden crown beard. It's native to Central America in the southwestern part of the U.S., and it's in the sunflower family. It has a beautiful yellow flower, so it was brought out to Midway in the 1940s as an ornamental. Somebody put it in their backyard, and then within a few decades, it spread across the atoll. And before we started a program to eradicate it, it covered about 70% of the atoll, and it grows so thick the albatross have a hard time getting through it, and the native plants are crowded out. And so by leaving the Verbicina there, it really threatens the whole, I guess, stability of the ecosystem. So we did start a program to eradicate the plant. We received $2 million in funding, and our plan is to eradicate it over a 10-year time frame. And so we're using technicians and volunteers and using a safe herbicide. So we started in earnest in about 2011, and so we took out all the mature plants, and then we worked on the seed bank, and then today in 2020, 99% of the Verbicina is gone. The seabirds have all responded by increasing their populations. The native plants are responding really well, so it's really a great success story in the making. Here's our technicians spraying the herbicide, and they use backpack sprayers, and they walk amongst the albatross to do all their work. We have a native greenhouse, so we're growing native plants in there to replace the non-native plants as we remove them. This is again our greenhouse, putting out our native plants. Here is the story about the rats I mentioned before. So they got out to Midway in the 1940s and caused just huge devastation. In fact, almost every island in the Pacific has rats or rodents on them, and they're really just a huge impact to seabirds. And so that's one of the programs that I also oversee, is to help eradicate rodents from all the islands in the Pacific. And slowly we're figuring out new techniques. We now use helicopters, and instead of it taking 4 years to eradicate rodents from an island, it can be done in 1 month. And so a lot more efficient. In fact, when we go to do the mouse eradication at Midway next summer, we'll use helicopters and hopefully get the job done in 1 month. But it'll be expensive. It's about $4.5 million to eradicate the mice out there. I'll pause there for a second to see if there's any questions. All right, so jump back into it. I was on the island when the 2011 Japanese tsunami hit Japan. We also were hit by the tsunami at Midway. So this picture here shows every area in red. This is where the water went. So again, we have 3 islands out there. Spit Island was completely washed over. Eastern Island was about 70% washed over, and Sand Island was about 40% washed over. So huge impacts. We lost 10,000 albatross eggs, 100,000 albatross chicks, 2,000 adult albatrosses, thousands of fish, hundreds of or probably 100,000 bone-in petrels, lots of other seabirds. And not only can this happen again, but it's also kind of a wake-up call for climate change. As the level of the ocean rises, we're going to see more and more washover of albatross habitat and seabird habitat, so we're going to lose more and more species. But by restoring native plants, it can build the resilience of the island by building up more dunes, so we have natural protection from these storm events, future tsunamis, and sea level rise. And also by restoring albatross, then we have more guano going into the island to feed the healthy native plants and to feed the corals, so hopefully the fringing reef can continue to keep up with sea level rise. So we can learn some important lessons with this tsunami that hit Midway in 2011. Here's some pictures of this is a bone-in petrel that was covered up in its burrow. These are albatross chicks that were washed inland off their nest, and vegetation was washed on top of them. These are adult albatross that got washed out to sea and were waterlogged. So a huge issue. This particular slide, it talks about the lead paint issue. So this is a Laysan albatross chick that's probably 4.5 months old. It's losing all its downy feathers. It's getting its main body feathers and flight feathers. And because it's near a building, it was eating paint that was chipping off the building, and it was succumbing to lead poisoning. One of the reasons we can tell it has lead poisoning is because its eyes are really squinty. Instead of bright brown big eyes, it has squinty eyes, and it can no longer hold up its wings. Usually they would hold up their wings and they lose control of their wings. So this bird ultimately died, and we were losing 10,000 chicks a year. I just saw a question pop up, but I missed it. But we were losing 10,000 chicks a year because of lead poisoning out there. And so we received some funding from the Department of Interior to completely clean all the lead paint off the old buildings out there, repaint them with a rubber paint to lock in any paint chips that were remaining. Then all the sand that was contaminated on the outside, we removed it, brought in clean sand, and then the old sand we mixed with a chemical to make the lead unavailable, and then we stored it in the middle of the island in a cement vault so that it wouldn't be a problem to seabirds. So these are the buildings after they're painted and fixed up. And this is all new beach sand that was brought in. And so now we don't see any dead albatross chicks from the lead poisoning. So again, huge project. This is the endangered short-tailed albatrosses. Albatross, I mentioned they were the most numerous albatross in the Pacific, and they were hunted for their feathers, and they're slowly recovering. There's about 3,000. And we currently have one pair at Midway, and the only reason we have a pair is because we put out decoys, and this is part of a social attraction project. And we played the calls that this bird makes, and that's how we were able to attract birds together and get them to start a new population. And so in 2007, 2008, these two birds met because of the social attraction, and they started to do a courtship dance, and then they laid a practice egg, and then 2010 they laid a real egg, and they were able to raise that chick, and it was able to fledge, and that was the first short-tailed albatross that's fallen away or it's been raised at Midway in historic times. So this is really significant, and hopefully over time we'll see that population continue to grow. And they're a large bird. Again, their wingspan is about 9 feet across. Again, these are the endangered Laysan ducks, one of the most endangered ducks on the planet. Again, they were found throughout all the Hawaiian Islands, but because of people and predators, they were reduced to just 2 breeding females in 1911 to Laysan Island. And from that small population, they recovered on Laysan, and then we decided to translocate ducks from Laysan to Midway to start a new population on Midway. And I was part of the team that created the habitat and brought the first ducks to Midway. I have a couple of slides. Historically, we had wetlands on Midway, but because of the military activities, they were filled in. So we first had to test areas to make sure they weren't contaminated by military activities. And then we used an excavator and a backhoe to dig into the sand to expose the fresh water. There's a freshwater lens underneath the island. And then we planted native plants. And once we brought the first group of ducks, we brought 22 ducks to Midway in 2004, and then 24 in 2005 for our starting population. And they slowly built up the population from just the 42 founders, and now we have 500 ducks at Midway in 2020. So we saw incredible population growth in the beginning, and then we had avian botulism that arrived to Midway. We think it came in with migratory ducks, and unfortunately we've been dealing with that over time. This botulism is a natural toxin, or it's produced by a bacteria that's found naturally in most dirt areas around the planet, but because of higher temperatures, it is more prevalent than it used to be, and it produces more toxin out there, and the ducks pick it up and they can get sick and die from the toxin. But we have an antitoxin that we can give the ducks that get it, and we're working on giving them a vaccine, so hopefully they'll have lifetime protection against this botulism. But despite these small setbacks, we've seen this incredible increase in the population, and so now we have ducks not only on Laysan Island, but on Midway, and then in 2014 I was with a group of people that moved the ducks to Curie Atoll, so now we have 3 populations of ducks out there. So again, pretty cool success story. And here's Midway, and here's Curie Atoll over here, the next population over. And here's Curie Island, and us and the U.S. Coast Guard actually helped us move the ducks. We used one of their ships and their crew members to carry the ducks over to the other island. We had them on the front of the ship, and us taking care of the ducks, and released them. This is Curie Atoll. Here's their leg bands, and beautiful little duck, just really a cool animal. So, and again, they're doing well on Curie. They had 30 young in 2015, and we moved 28 ducks to Curie, and there's about 50 there. So again, nice population. Over the years, we've had different visitor programs, so there's a chance for visitors to come to see Midway, to see the unique historical resources, the natural resources. And when I was at Midway, we bring out 18 people at a time, and it was between December and May each year. They'd stay on the island for a week. They would learn about the history, the wildlife. They were able to go snorkeling. They were able to ride bikes around the island and even help with habitat restoration. And this program lasted until about 2012. And then because of some funding reductions, we unfortunately weren't able to staff the visitor program anymore. So it's currently on hold, but if in the future we have additional funding, we can still potentially have a visitor program. Even though we don't have visitors that come out, we still have volunteer opportunities for people to come out and volunteer for 3 to 6 months at a time to help out with the seabirds, or we have permanent jobs out at Midway as well. So maybe think about a volunteer opportunity or even a paid opportunity at Midway in the future. And so here's some of the volunteers that have helped out in the past. And I'm almost finished, but the final part of the mission I talked about is our emergency landing strip out at Midway. Congress gives the Fish and Wildlife Service additional funding to continue to maintain that airfield out there just in case there's an emergency landing. And over the years, we've had several emergency landings, 2004, 2009, 2011, 2012, 2014. And so when I was there, we had this Continental 777 aircraft with about 400 people. They had a bird that crashed into, actually I'm confusing that, one of their engines had to be shut down. I think they basically lost oil in one of the engines and they had to shut off the engine, so they're flying on one engine. There was a chance they could have crashed, but fortunately Midway was there, they landed safely, and all 400 lives were saved. So again, this other part of our mission is super important as well. Also, because of the airfield and the harbor, we're able to help injured fishermen or people that are hurt on ships that are transporting cargo across the Pacific. And so we work with the Coast Guard to basically medevac the patients off of Midway. And so again, it's a good position for people to be in. And that's the end of my presentation. Again, I just am really thankful that I had the opportunity to present to all of you today. And I appreciate all that you're doing, and I'll take any questions now.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think Amber had a question about the birds, if she wants to ask.
What exactly is a practice egg?
That's a good question. Practice egg is not a very scientific or technical term. So basically, they produced an infertile egg to begin with, their first time. So they sat on it, and it didn't hatch. So it was infertile, and so they did practice with that for a couple of months until basically it rotted and it ended up exploding, and then it just disappeared in the sand. So that was their practice attempt. And then the next year, they produced a fertile egg, and it hatched, and they were able to fledge their chick. So good question.
It wasn't like that they intentionally laid it just for practice. It just turned out to be considered that.
Correct. Yep. Yep. They, I think if they had to do it over, they would have produced a fertile egg, and it wouldn't have been a practice. It would have been a real attempt. So, but I will say that another pair of short-tailed albatross, they took over a black-footed egg. They didn't actually lay it, but they pushed the black-footed pair off their egg, and they took over their egg, and they did practice with that for the season, and they ended up fledging, or they ended up feeding that black-footed chick, and it was able to fledge and fly away. So they did practice with somebody else's egg that was a different pair. So they've been known to practice with other species' eggs as well. So that one turned out.
And then Braylon had a question as well. I think I doubled to you, but yeah, go ahead, Braylon.
Oh, the last question I asked was, with there being, traveling by, air, has there like been cases where like the sounds from like the jet engines or helicopters have like scared away any of like the migratory birds, or while they're mating or nesting? And then the other part of the question was, with that being said, has there been any cases of like air pollutions?
Yeah, so very good question. The first part of your question, there's a huge concern about the safety of aircraft and wildlife, particularly the seabirds out there. So number one, we definitely don't want to impact the seabirds, and we don't want to have any accidents with aircraft either. And so the albatrosses, they don't typically fly at night. It's only during the day they fly. So when you're at Midway and you look up at the sky during the day, I mean, there are albatrosses every 5 feet. And so the sky is just full of albatrosses. And so if you brought a plane in with albatrosses that have a 6 to 7 foot wingspan, I mean, that's suicide. So we learned to only bring in the aircraft at night when the albatross are flying. So that way it's safe for people and safe for the aircraft. That said, we still have birds that fly at night, and so some of the ground nesting birds fly at night, but we found that most of their activity occurs right at dusk, and so we avoid flying aircraft in during the day or at dusk for most of the year. So most of the operations come in like at 9 o'clock p.m., and we found that's a safe window to come in so that it's safe for people and safe for the seabirds. And unfortunately, there's only about one flight every 3 weeks, and so there's minimal sound impact to the wildlife and the seabirds out there. And so it's kind of a balance. That small little impact is worth all the protection and the restoration that we're doing out there. Let's see, the second part of your question, I think it was a question about pollution.
Yes, sir, it was about the air pollution. So with you guys only using airplanes in order to be able to get to Midway, has there been any problems with like air pollution, or probably like leakage of like fuel or gas from the actual airplanes themselves?
Yeah, so fortunately, the air pollution from the aircraft coming out to Midway has been very minimal, so we feel good about that. We don't feel good about having to burn diesel fuel to run our generator, our power plant at Midway. So when we first inherited our power plant from the military, we had generators that burned about 2,000 gallons a day of jet fuel to basically keep the lights on. And over time, we've reduced the size of the generators based on how many people are out there. And so now we have small little generators that only burn about 250 to 300 gallons of jet fuel a day. So still significant, but the fact that we need the emergency landing strip for commercial airliners that fly over the Pacific and to keep our restoration going, that's a significant savings. Ideally, we'd go completely solar. So now we have solar water heaters on the homes out there. We have solar panels for the freezers out on Midway, and so slowly we're making the change to all solar. So that would be fantastic one day to have only solar and not have any air pollution out there. When I first arrived to Midway, there was a small well, it was relatively significant fuel spill. The fuel tanks that we inherited from the military, not to knock the military, but they were older, and there was one of the fuel tanks leaked underground, and so there was a leak of 90,000 gallons of jet fuel underneath the sand that cost us about $1 million to clean up. So we cleaned up all the spilled fuel, and we ended up replacing all those fuel tanks, and we have new above ground tanks now that are double walled and much safer. So again, there is a risk to having the fuel out there in terms of air pollution or other pollution out there.
And Haley has a question if you want to ask Haley. I don't know if she has connection or not.
Oh, okay. Do I need to chat her or anything? Or
I think well, I can read her question too. But what she had asked was, what has been the most rewarding part of your job, and is there any specific project or event you planned or coordinated that will forever stick with you?
I would say hands down the translocation of endangered Laysan ducks to Midway from Laysan Island. So exciting to be part of that. I think of that regularly in my current job, and that's one of the highlights of my career, and there's so many aspects to it. My team and we planned the habitat restoration to create those seeps, those wetlands on Midway. We did the habitat restoration, we brought in the native plants, we physically went to Laysan Island, we captured the ducks, we did a study ahead of time to look at maximizing the genetic variation of which ducks to capture on Laysan Island, which ones to bring. We captured them, we had to figure out what to feed them on the ship coming over. We had to build aviaries, we did a soft release, and then we had transmitters in every bird to follow them around, and to go from 42 founders to over 500 today and have a third population on Curie has been really exciting. So it's been awesome.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
Well, I think you pretty much answered all the other questions in the chat box, but if anyone else has a last minute question, you're welcome to ask it now. Go ahead, Amber.
I was just wondering, like, 'cause I'm sure you've worked on other stuff than just like with this. What made you decide to share this particular project with us?
I think I have worked on other projects. For example, I started my career with the National Marine Fisheries Service in Alaska, and I monitored catches of foreign vessels that were working with American vessels. So that was pretty exciting. I've done some other work out of Galveston, Texas, working on oil platform removals and making sure there's few impacts to wildlife. And again, exciting work. But so much of my life was spent on Midway, 12 years out there, and the resources are just so exciting. And then to see not instant, but to see success out there. I think there's a lot of sad stories in conservation, with climate change and pollution and marine debris, but to be able to go out there and work with volunteers and to remove debris from the islands, to bring Laysan ducks there, to restore habitat, to remove rats and verbicina and see albatross increase, to see short-tail albatross nest for the first time. It's really gratifying. So it's a big part of my life. I think of it a lot, and I wanted to share this with you guys. So.
Awesome. Well, thanks, John. I think everybody is so excited that you joined us today. I can see in the chat box, Adrian's trying to recruit people to go have a job there. So hopefully.
Yeah. So I have a quick question, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
So do you know much about the volunteer portion for it?
I do, yeah. If you Google volunteer Midway, it should pop up, and that shows you how to apply. And I think they take volunteers for 6 months at a time, and it is a life-changing experience. So I would recommend it.
That's what I'm reading right now. So if you know about the volunteer position, I noticed that you're out there for 6 months. So I'm sure volunteers aren't getting paid, but are the resources like food and stuff out there for them?
Yep, housing is provided, phenomenal food's provided, your transportation's provided from Honolulu, and so you don't lose money once you get there, and it is a life-changing experience. So gratifying.
Is it competitive?
I think that, because it's so unique, it is fairly competitive. I think, maybe 50 people apply for 6 positions every 6 months. So it is pretty competitive. So, definitely make sure you build up your resume. And again, I'd recommend it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, she's sold.
All right.
Awesome. Yeah, if anybody, does anybody have any other questions? If not, I think we'll say our thank yous to John again and hope everything's going well for you in DC.
All right.